everyone, Joshua Hanlon here, and today I'm on the deck of the USS Orleck, a destroyer ship here in Jacksonville, Florida. And I'm joined by Zack. He's going to give us a little bit of an overview of the history of this ship and then point out some of the really interesting stuff you can see if you come to Jacksonville and visit this here. So thanks so much for joining me today. If you want to, just start off with kind of a little bit of the background and story of what this ship has been through.
Of course. So the USS Orleck was commissioned shortly after the end of World War II out of Port Orange, Texas. It went on to serve in both the Korea and the Vietnam War, where it was cited for multiple points of its time in service there in both those wars. It went on to serve from 1989 to about 1999 with the Turkish Navy in the first Gulf War with them, and then it was sold back to the U.S. to be as a museum ship in both Port Orange, Texas, and then went and moved to Lake Charles, Louisiana, where it was actually, it went through 3 different hurricanes in its time frame.
Wow.
There. In one of them, it was actually ripped from its moorings, sent up the Mississippi River, took some damage from different barges and obstacles that were in the river there. And then in March, in last year of 2022, it was sold to the Jacksonville Naval Museum, and it was towed up here after a stint in the shipyard there and was brought here by 2 different tugboats, and we've been here ever since.
Yeah, so it had an amazing journey both as an active duty ship and as a museum ship.
Absolutely.
It's been through a whole lot here.
Yeah, it has. It's been through a lot. In Korea, these guns behind us actually fired over 11,000 rounds of ammunition, and then in Vietnam, it served even longer there. It's been known as the train buster of the Korean War and then the gray ghost off the Vietnam coast. So it's been through a lot of time in service.
Going back to the early history of this ship, what would a ship have been like this been designed for? Like, what were the typical kind of duties and things that these types of ships would have done as it was built and they had in mind?
So this ship was, when it was originally designed, was used for anti-submarine warfare, or ASW. In the Korean War, what it was used for was train busting. So what they would do is they would wait off the coast of both Korea and Vietnam, and they would wait at nighttime, and they would see a light shining along the coast. When they saw that light, they knew that that was a train, and then when that light would disappear, they knew that that was a tunnel, and that's what they would typically aim for in order to disrupt supply lines.
So they could, fire from the sea. They could pinpoint targets. What was the rough range of some of these guns that were on board here?
So these guns were typically accurate up to 7 to 9 miles. So they were able to see where they were aiming. And then as time progressed, they advanced their technology capabilities, kind of strayed away from being able to just use their guns into being able to use things like ASROC or anti-submarine rockets. And then that's what they were able to use for more submarine warfare as well.
And how does it work then when a ship like this is transitioned? You said it went to the Turkish Navy, is that right? So is that kind of common that older U.S. Navy vessels will be sent to other countries? How does that work?
So with the partnership with other nations, you can see that turnover rate. It kind of depends on what the Navy wants to do at the time based off of the capabilities of that ship and the needs of the other nation. So it's a working partnership with those nations.
Right. And it's only been here in Jacksonville now we're coming up on a year now in March of 2023. So what has that experience been like for everyone at the ship as you've kind of figured out how to run a museum ship here in Jacksonville?
It's been a pretty crazy experience. At first it was working through dealing with the maintenance that we had to go through. Of course, dealing with COVID and the pandemic, we were dealing a lot with supply chain issues, getting paint itself for the ship. We had to completely repaint the decks, paint pretty much every structure on the ship. We had to scrape rust off of it, resurface a lot of it, weld things. So dealing with a lot of the maintenance issues alone was quite the experience. We couldn't do it with the help of our volunteers. A lot of them are actually retired Navy, coming on board and just being able to help out. But yeah, all the donations we've gotten, dealing with admissions, all that money goes directly back into restoring the ship to what it is today and keep moving forward from that.
Yeah, that is really, really cool because ships like this are such an important part of U.S. history, and it's amazing for the public to be able to come on and just experience this in person and walk the decks and see so much of this, with their own eyes and not just, see photos or a documentary.
Absolutely, especially being able to partner with the local military community in town. We've been getting a lot of commands from Jacksonville and Mayport area to be able to come down and allow their sailors a chance to be able to come on board and experience the naval history and the tradition that's been carried on throughout the years.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much for the overview of the ship. Now we'll walk around a little bit and take a closer look at some specific parts of it.
Absolutely.
Now we're going to take a closer look at one of the turrets on board the USS Orleck. So as we make our way inside this turret, what can you tell us about this?
So originally this ship was outfitted with 3 of these turrets. It was a 5-inch 38 caliber gun, and these rounds could be fired about 15 rounds per minute. At first, crews inside could range from anywhere from 7 to 11 people. Ideally, you'd have 11 people inside that were all stationed to have their own jobs inside. And then as we come inside, you can see the cramped quarters they were working with.
I was just going to say that, yeah. You were saying so it'd be 11 people inside here?
Up to 11
Wow.
people inside. You'd have different positions for everybody. It was all hand-loaded from the magazine down below to where you'd have up to 15 people down below handing up ammunition and magazine shells from down below.
Yeah, so it was kind of a whole operation inside these. I mean, almost like a factory type of idea.
Oh yeah, it was essentially they would take the assembly line idea and everyone had their station to be able to work as efficiently as possible.
And you mentioned some of the work that's being done on the ship and already been done, and you can see some of those supplies here, so I'm sure the upkeep of a vessel like this is not an easy thing.
Oh yeah, usually we have about 1 or 2 people that can work in this area by themselves. We have one who's a retired Coast Guard member who's working in here, and he's chipped all the old paint, he's cleaned it from top to bottom, and he's done an amazing job at working through this space alone.
And if you can, maybe try to paint a little bit of a picture of the experience of what those guys, up to 11 guys that you said would be in here. When this was actively firing, what was the noise, kind of the heat, the smell? I'm sure all of that kind of played a big part in the experience that these guys were having.
So here currently we have the luxury of having these hatches open. We can get a fresh breeze through here. The only hatch that was open during war times or when these rounds were firing was a small hatch above us, where that was the only source of real fresh air that we could get. Inside, you're having people being able to yell over each other and really being able to communicate clearly with each other over a yell. You'd have, back then, of course, everyone was smoking back then. That was the common thing. With it being such an enclosed space, that's all you were breathing in was that smoke, the chemicals from the rounds being fired, and it could be a very dangerous position being in here because these covers are more meant for weather protection than actual ballistic protection inside. So these rounds were, if you weren't being effective at your job, then you were putting the rest of your crew in danger. So that was the main focus, and that was the mentality, was you depended on the guy next to you, the guy next to you depended on you to be able to go home at the end of the tour. Right,
you all had to work together as a team, but yeah, it's amazing to come into these turrets and see the environment that they would have had to work in here. Absolutely. And imagine what that would have been like.
Oh yeah, these rounds you had to be able to grab from the magazine loader here, be able to grab it, roll it onto the gun itself and be able to fire it. And over time, like I said, these rounds started at 15 rounds per minute. As you get tired and you slow down, you're looking more about 10 to 11 rounds per minute, just based off of the wear down and endurance of your crew.
We found our way up a flight of stairs and next to something that you don't necessarily expect to see on the deck of a destroyer. So what is this?
So this is our DASH, or drone anti-submarine helicopter. It was one of the first few drone or anti-manned helicopters that was in naval service. So what they would do is they would strap 2 miniature torpedoes to the bottom of this, and they would have it launch off the helo deck we have here and go out and search for submarines, or be able to go out and fight submarines if they needed to. It's being so short in their time frame, kind of their primitive design, they of course ran into some issues. It was really good at taking off and landing, being fully loaded with those 2 torpedoes, but as soon as one would fall and they would launch one of those torpedoes, all of a sudden that balance was thrown off, and it was known to actually flip over, or it would end up going off on its own course, and so they would have to be able to be ready to shoot it down if it decided to come back and kind of go off on its own.
Wow. So what years roughly was this in service then?
This was, I believe, towards the Vietnam era.
Okay.
The ship went through a few different remodels and restructures throughout its time frame.
And this was unmanned then, correct? So what was the guidance system like? How did that work?
So it was pretty much remote control at the time. On board, we could actually store up to 2 of these helicopters at one time. And they would control it from the Command Information Center, or CIC, and they'd be able to control where it was going through that and radar.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And then we're on just kind of a general kind of helicopter deck here. So were there more traditional helicopters as well that would come and go from the ship?
So they could land a normal helo from here, or a helicopter, and they'd be able to transfer personnel or supplies and things like that, or evacuate people from a war zone if they needed to.
Behind us now is the ASROC launcher, and so this would be kind of a newer piece of equipment from the ship's service history. So what can you tell us about this, and then kind of the broader way that the ship might have changed over the decades that it was in service? So
originally, when it was in commission, this area would have things like torpedo tubes or depth charges. So when this refram or refamiliarization, they installed an ASROC launcher, or anti-submarine rocket launcher. So what it did is it had a full-size torpedo, it would strap on a rocket booster to it, and they'd load it in through the front of this launcher, and then when they needed to use it, they would angle it out towards where the submarine was, and they would launch the ASROC out, and the rocket would go out about 9 miles out. It would detach from that torpedo. The torpedo would drop into the water with a parachute, and it was so accurate that it would just circle straight downwards and strike the top of the submarine. And that was the most effective way of damaging the submarine.
Wow, yeah, it's amazing to see how the kind of technology changed, from when this was first finished in like the 1940s, and how it was able to improve that technology.
Yeah, so this was installed around Vietnam era, where it went from Vietnam and then transitioning over to the Gulf War with the Turkish Navy.
And where would a lot of those changes typically be done? Would it go back to the same kind of port typically, or how did that work?
It would come into the U.S. Or to a friendly port. They would haul it out. They would do their normal maintenance and repairs, whatever needed to be done in a dry dock. And then they would come in, bring engineers and things like that, and then install that piece of equipment.
Now, it sounds like this was specifically to target submarines. Was this used in combat ever?
I'm not totally sure if it was used in combat. I know we didn't do a whole lot of combat with submarines with the Vietnam era, but crews had to go through normal training and being able to familiarize themselves pretty routinely with this equipment. So they were pretty effective at being able to use it if they ever needed to.
Yeah, some great insight. We've come up even higher on the ship now to the signal bridge. We've got a couple of different sections here. So what is this first section right in front of us?
So this is what we call a weapon director. So what it would do is it would rotate towards wherever we thought that there was another vessel or a threat, and they could send out a radiated signal from the dish here. They would send it out, and when it bounced back, that's where we could tell things like what kind of vessel it was, how far away it was, and we could use that, input it into our weapon systems to be able to get a firing solution and be able to accurately fire on that possible threat if need be.
So a lot of that was driven by technology. You don't have a guy sitting here with binoculars or something necessarily trying to figure all that out.
Yeah, it took away the idea of needing to kind of walk in your shots of, oh, this round, your first round is short or it's long. This allowed us to give a more accurate idea of where we needed to fire, which also decreased our need for how many rounds we needed to fire as well.
Right. And then what is this area over here?
So here, if we look up above, the large rectangle, that is our surface search radar, which that's what we would be able to use to find other ships, being able to tell the contours of the Earth as well. And then the smaller dish that's actually spinning right now, that is our air search radar. That's what we'd be able to use to find planes and helicopters, things like that. And then even below that, that's our signalman's bridge. And that's where a signalman would be able to use, they'd be able to work out of there to maintain their flags that they would use to communicate with other ships using a certain international flag code, where each flag designates a certain letter or number or command. They would use that to be able to communicate with a strike group or a group of ships, where if they're turning or they were traveling together, they would have to all be on the same page and turn at the exact same time so they didn't run into each other.
That's interesting because we were just talking about the technology aspect with the targeting system, and yet you have these very physical symbols here used still to communicate. So was that in addition to things like radio communications and things of that nature?
So back then, radio technology, you're still trying to iron out the issues that, or the bugs that you would have in the system. So the Navy always wanted to have a non-technologically advanced system in case that technology broke down. And a lot of the time, flag code was more reliable than your radios. So essentially, if it's not broke, don't fix it. So you can't break something that's not technologically advanced. So flag code was always their backup.
Now, is this area that we're at now the highest part that a visitor can get to? And how often do people go up to that section?
So this is the highest that visitors can get to. Up above is what we would call a loft work, which when the ship was in service, they would have to get a approval from the CO. They'd have to make an announcement, they would secure their electronics, and people could go up and work aloft using a harness and safety belts, things like that. So very rarely, if ever, do we go up there to be able to work, just based off of being able to keep our volunteers safe and things like that.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And if we walk over this direction, I noticed you've got kind of the cheat codes for the types of signals here. So how did this section work?
So what they would do is they'd be able to attach the flags based off of the rings that they attach the halyards to, and they would clip on to these little grooves here, and that's how they would be able to quickly grab the flag, be able to hoist it up as fast as they needed to, and they'd be able to hook the line directly into that ring, so it was more efficient to being able to raise up the flag as orderly and non-confused as they could.
When the ship was at sea, especially being kind of this high up and this high above the water, were there any dangers there, especially maybe in rougher waters? What was that like in terms of kind of keeping the crew safe?
So with the crew, you're always told you keep one hand for the ship, one hand for yourself. So you're walking along these rails, holding onto the rail as need be. And then being up here, you're trained as well as being able to be qualified to handle the flags or the technology that you're working with. Typically, the commands are pretty good at keeping the ship as stable as possible and being able to control where the ship's pointed to allow workers the safest possible environment to work in. The command is always aware of what kind of work is getting done based off of the communication along the chain of command. So working together, they were able to create a more safer environment for sailors.
Sure, that makes sense. And I also wanted to walk this direction as well. So I've noticed in other spots on the ships, these tubes here. I wanted to make sure we talked about these. At first, it looks very strange, like what in the world are all these tubes doing here? So how would these have been used?
So we get a lot of guests asking if these are firework tubes. Unfortunately, they're not. We would love to be
Now
able
I'm disappointed.
I know, we would love to be able to do 4th of July fireworks from here, but they're what we call chaff. What it does is it shoots out essentially a radiated cloud of tinfoil. And that defense system allows us to confuse things like missiles and rockets because it's using the same technology that we're using on our weapon director of sending out a radiated signal to be able to keep that weapon on course. So being able to fire up a cloud of radiated tinfoil, we're able to confuse that signal to allow the ship to be safe.
Here we go. Thank you.
Of course. And then as we go, these searchlights here, this is what they're able to use to send out things like Morse code and being able to use them for search and rescue based off of the use of their shutter that's in the light itself.
Again, another form of communication like we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. More than one way of communicating always allows people a chance to be able to get the word out.
Now we found our way into a room with quite a lot of gadgets and readouts here. So what is this room and what kind of activities would have happened in here?
So this is our bridge here. In here you'd have the captain or the CO, the second in command or the XP or XO. A lot of different terminology in here.
It's hard to keep track of.
It is. It's very difficult. But the captain would be the only one allowed to sit in that chair over there. And the XO was the only one allowed to sit in the chair opposite it. And then you'd have different personnel that were stationed throughout the bridge here. You'd have the helmsman, who was in charge of steering the ship. You'd have an engine controlman, who was the only one who was able to use this system to send an indicator down below to the engine room of how fast or to slow down or even go in reverse based off of the indicator here. You'd have someone who was logging the course of the ship through one of these stations here. You'd have someone working the radars, the weapon indicators. Every different system on here had another person whose sole job was to work that system. Throughout the ship, we actually have things like the status board behind us, where they actually are still in the Turkish language. We really wanted to be able to ensure that guests were able to understand that the ship wasn't just a U.S. vessel, and that we're continuing that history of being able to show and expose visitors of the idea that the ship was in another service, still being able to be helpful. And then we've got our chart table here, where people would be able to plot the course of the ship, where it's supposed to be going, where it is really going. And we've actually been fortunate enough to get a lot of donations from the community and having a local map of the St. John's River.
Now, would a chart table like this, is this something you would still see on a modern naval ship today? Is this the type of thing that, you know, you still use kind of paper charts and that sort of thing?
Absolutely. Paper charts are continuously being used. Essentially, like I said before, the lowest possible technologically advanced system that we have is always a great backup, because you can't run into faults if it's not technologically controlled. So sailors are still being taught how to plot the course itself with things like rulers and slides and compass, and just being able to understand where the ship is going. I know officers, they're still taught by being able to plot the course of the ship by the stars. They're still being taught those basic systems because it allows them to always be able to fall back on those systems.
Right, and it looks like this chart here is actually the St. John's River here in Jacksonville. So this is a very local chart.
Yes, it allows guests to be able to really understand what the sailors are experiencing while still keeping it relevant to the local area. So guests are able to come by and they can see where exactly on the chart we are. We say chart because any chart that shows water, that's a chart. Maps are for land.
Okay.
So again, lots of terminology based off of what service and military branch you're in.
The military loves acronyms,
Yes.
terminology. It's the
Yes,
most important part.
Whatever keeps them special in their own way, they love to have it. Any way to allow what people think is easier for members to understand Of course, when you're out at sea or you're in a war zone, the more acronyms they're able to use, the better, because they can be quicker to transfer information that way.
Perfect. Well, it's so interesting to come into a room like this where it can be very overwhelming, I think, for a lot of visitors, because there is so much here and it just kind of hits you all at once and you're like, what is all this stuff for? So I appreciate you kind of breaking it down a little bit and explaining some of that.
Of course, by yourself, there's no way we'd be able to control the ship all by one person, which just reinforces the idea that being in military service, you're a team, you're working with someone else at all times, because this job's impossible by yourself.
Now we're inside the Combat Information Center, and here you can see a lot more panels and readouts of things and a lot more knobs and controls. But you also have this machine right behind you that's actually kind of, giving you some idea of kind of what it sounded like in here. So you've got kind of bringing it to life for visitors here a little bit.
Yeah, so throughout the ship, we've worked with a local stage production community where they've outrigged different spots in the ship to have different broadcasts and allow visitors to really understand the sounds and experience what it was like on the ship, with a crew of over 300 people in this ship alone.
So you had to fit 300 people in all these different areas on the ship, and I'm sure, we already saw in the turret how crowded that could be. I'm sure every part of this ship, when it was fully manned, got very crowded.
Oh yeah, so there's no part of this ship that's wasted space. Wasted space is a waste of money. So if they could put people in it, put them to work, there was always a way to make that happen. So there could be upwards of 20 people in this one room, each with a certain job, to make sure that everything ran smoothly and as quickly as need be.
You pointed out something earlier as we were walking in here that I think was it this board here, one of these panels, where the guy who would work there actually had to write backwards, correct?
Yeah, so this status board up in front of us, they would be able to record anything that was outside, so any ships, planes, anything that people were tracking. They would record it on this board here, and someone would stand on the far end of it, and they would be trained to write backwards, so that way they could record everything without getting in the way of the people that were still tracking things, so that everyone was able to be aware of what was going on at any one time.
There was such an immense variety of skill sets needed and kind of jobs that had to be done here.
Yeah, everyone was specialized in their own job, as well as being able to replace someone based off of if they were hurt, if they were sick, even if they had transferred or they weren't on the ship anymore. People were still able to move around this spot to be able to fill those gaps whenever people needed to. And that couch back there is actually the couch that they used in the movie Greyhound with Tom Hanks. They actually took this couch off the ship, put it on the USS Kidd, and they were able to film the movie off of the Kidd with that couch.
Well, there you go. You've got historical accuracy when you're taking it straight off the ship.
Exactly. That's the best part. Tom Hanks actually lays down on that couch. He's actually longer than the couch is wide. Somehow in the movie, it's magically the right size for him. But yeah, it was a great addition to the ship, was being able to restore that ship using the original couch for it. And then as we move backwards, this is the chart room where they stored all the charts for the ship. So they always had a point of reference so no one got lost. Because when you're out in the big blue ocean, everything is big and blue. There's always endless amounts of places to learn in here. And then this room behind us is our radio central. In here, your radio men would be able to work to transfer communications through different ships or to land communications. And in the back, we have some red control boxes. And those boxes were specifically used to transmit top secret information using their encoding system to be able to receive and transmit top secret information. They would actually lock this door, and the only way you could pass information was through this little window here, and they would be able to directly receive and pass notes to the radio men to be able to send that information out.
Yeah, because you've got to think about, information is extremely important in a situation like this. Like you said, it's the big blue ocean out there, and if the wrong information gets out and maybe your location is leaked to the wrong people, that could obviously end very badly. So it's something you don't necessarily think about is how important, keeping radio communication secure is.
Yeah, the old saying, loose lips sink ships. Exact reason why being able to control that flow of information allows you to be able to quickly send that information to the right person.
We're back outside now on the torpedo deck, correct?
Correct. Yeah, so up here they would have 2 different torpedo launchers. They would have 3 torpedo tubes each. And what they would do is they would use compressed air to be able to launch torpedoes out from these tubes to be able to combat submarines. And then we've also got a display of what a training torpedo or what a full-size torpedo would usually look like. Really allows the guest to be able to really comprehend the different size of what a torpedo looks like, contrary to what movies or TV shows would make you believe. They would actually have to move these torpedoes by hand back aft where we had our torpedo storage room, go down a flight of stairs, back up that flight of stairs, and be able to manually load them into these torpedo tubes in order to reload to be used.
Wow, so you had to be able to manually move these things around quite a bit in order to get them to where they actually needed to be fired off.
Yeah, they would typically use their kind of younger, stronger members to be able to move these torpedoes by hand throughout the ship. It was not an easy job to do, but someone's got to do it.
And what era would a torpedo like this kind of represent then?
That would be any time frame, really. A lot of the improvements in torpedoes were mostly internal. The concept of torpedoes hasn't really changed throughout the years. Essentially, the outside is a very basic tube, and then inside is where the electronics, your fuel type, your explosive type even, that's where that would change. So the basic concept hasn't changed a whole lot.
So once this was fired out of one of these tubes here, was there much of a guidance system on this? How did that work?
So inside the torpedo, there's actually a computer. It sends out a radar or a sonar signal, and that sonar signal would bounce off the ship, come back to the torpedo. That computer would read that signal, and that's how it would be able to understand where the ship was and where it needed to steer. And then inside it had a fuse to be able to know how long to run for, or if it needed to explode before it hit a certain object. That's how it would be able to be worked. So this is the most forward part of the ship, or the bow, and this is where you'd have your anchor chain or your mooring lines and our forward turret, which also, this is, I believe, the best view of the city, downtown Jacksonville. You've got multiple bridges, and then you've got both sides of the river that you're able to see. Pretty much year-round, you're able to get a great view of the city from here.
There you go. So, you come for the destroyer history, but you can also stay for the incredible views of the city. It's a 2-for-1 when you visit the ship here.
Exactly. It's a great location for us. We love being down here. Really allows lifelong locals to first-day visitors to be able to come down and get a completely different view of the city from just this one ship.
Now you've got this kind of held onto shore here with all these different ropes. So in bad weather, how does that work? Is there much concern about things like, crashing into the shore or making sure that the ship doesn't move too much?
Yeah, so during hurricane season, Jacksonville, Florida, we get tons of hurricane seasons. What we do is we partner with the local naval communities, and we have sailors come out and we double up the amount of lines on board. So I think last year we had up to 14 or 15 different lines that connected us to the pier. We take out all the slack in the lines, make them as tight as possible, allows the ship to be as secure as possible. When a hurricane came through last year, it came directly through Jacksonville. A lot of St. Augustine and some of Jacksonville saw flooding. The ship was completely stable, and luckily we fared a lot better than what it how it's handled in Louisiana, dealing with the hurricanes there as well. So we're very proud of the commitment we had with the Navy, being able to make sure the ship stayed safe during those hurricanes.
Yeah, it's so cool to hear about kind of all the different groups of people that come together, where it's the volunteers or all those different people that you've mentioned that are able to help keep a ship like this afloat.
Yeah, it takes a ton of people, a lot of cooperation with everybody. We get visitors and volunteers up from Kingsland, up in Georgia, all the way down to Jacksonville. We've even got a guy who comes in from Texas, Louisiana, and they fly in to be able to help with this ship along with the ships that they work on back home. It's a great experience to be able to really expose yourself to the welcoming and generous community that we have that help us every day. When the current's really coming through here, we see a pretty strong current, and all of a sudden we'll see groups of dolphins flying out of the water and keeping us entertained. So we'll actually go back this way and we'll go on into the wardroom. They actually sheared off the props in order to bring it here, so it doesn't run. There's no way for propulsion, but we've still got our rudders. I believe they're welded in place though, so it has to be towed wherever it's going to go.
Gotcha.
But so this room we're in, this was actually the baker's berthing. So in here they would have their the ship's cooks and their bakers that would stay in here. And this is what the racks look like. So it was about maybe an inch or two thick mattress that was brand new. Of course, the younger members would get the older mattresses, and their mattress wouldn't be as thick. So what they would do is they would be able to put poles in the tops of these rack holders to keep the sailor in the rack during rough weather, or they would tuck their boots under their mattress to provide a little bit of a lip, and that kept yourself in the rack. Inside, we've actually got one propped up here where this was all the storage a young member would have. They would maybe have this little drawer here for their daily use items, so their toiletries, things like that. And then the coffin locker, you have your little spaces inside where you'd store your change of clothes, your uniform items, and whatever you brought on board.
Yeah, it's amazing how you had to get your kind of worldly belongings compressed to just a few important things. You couldn't bring a whole lot.
Your privacy, all you would have were these curtains that would ride on these rails here, and this was your home. This was your little piece of home away from home, and being able to compress essentially your entire belongings, your life, into what could fit in here was, you had to bring your bare essentials and maybe a few personal items, and that was it.
How long was a tour of duty typically for a sailor here?
It kind of depends. The ship could go out anywhere from maybe 4 to 6 months at a time usually, but you could be stationed on board up to 4 years, 4 to or so years, depending on the time frame you were here.
You can hear some more of those sound effects going on.
Yeah, these sound effects are motion activated, so whenever anyone walks by, it'll activate. And throughout the ship, you'll hear it and be able to understand. You might not be in the room, but you can still hear everything that's going on throughout the ship. And it's really good to be able to get that immersive feeling throughout. This is where your officers would come and sit and eat. They would be able to talk about what's going on in the ship. The captain would sit at the head of the table here, and on that table there would actually be a little control panel where he could plug in a headset and he could talk throughout the ship wherever he needed to be able to get information if something was going on. They could also bring in a projector and watch movies in here, and this is where officers could come and relax and be away from the rest of the crew, as well as during times of casualties or they needed to perform surgeries on board, they could actually remove some of these light panels and ceiling tiles, bring down additional lighting, and this table would be the operating table on board. So it was, a lot of these spaces are multi-use, and you have to use the space you have.
But you can see there were some perks for being an officer on board ship. So as crowded as it was with all these people on here, certain people did have some better privileges.
Oh yeah, of course, We have another saying on board, with rank comes privilege. So the higher your rank, the more privileges you get, the better your lifestyle is. Really allows sailors to understand you have to work for what you want. And so the longer you put in effort, the higher your rank, the better your privileges, and the better your life on board is.
There you go. It makes sense.
Yeah. And then over there, we've got the Mr. Joseph Orleck. Joseph Orleck was the son of Eastern Europe immigrants. They came to the U.S., they settled in Ohio, and he served in World War II, not because he was drafted, but he volunteered for service. He had a very strong patriotic duty, really wanted to serve the country that he lived in. And he joined the Navy. Eventually, he gained a wartime commission. His senior officers recognized his leadership potential, promoted him to an officer, and when he was a lieutenant, he was the commanding officer of a war seagoing tug, where his job was to go out, hook up to damaged vessels, bring them out of the war zone to be repaired and get back into the fight. During his time in service, he cited for 2 points of extreme bravery, where the first time he was going out rescuing a damaged vessel and saw that there were about 5 people in the water. He dropped his personal, what they call a whaleboat. It was his, as a commanding officer, his boat to his small boat, and he went out, picked up these 5 people from the water and brought them on board and rescued them, saved their lives, and then grabbed the vessel and brought it back to safety. The second time of extreme bravery was actually his last. He was going off to rescue another vessel that was damaged. I believe it was off the coast of Sicily. Came under fire from Nazi artillery and seagoing mines. Essentially, his vessel became so damaged that he ordered the evacuation of his entire crew. He then was brought back on board by himself, his XO, and the chief bosun mate of the ship. They went back into range of enemy artillery fire to provide the ability and distraction for the rest of his crew to go to safety. And there was a fire that developed on board, engulfed the ship, and the ship actually exploded, which he then perished in that wreck. And so in his honor, they named this vessel after him, and these tracings are actually direct copies from his headstone in Arlington. Mm-hmm. So the Navy decided to recognize his extreme bravery and commitment to duty by naming the ship after him in his honor.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing. That's a fascinating story, and you can see kind of the men that came before these ships are named after.
Yeah, the Navy really likes to recognize and be proudful of that extreme dedication, and what better way to recognize him and follow his legacy than name the ship after him. A lot of the crews that come on board these ships, they really personalize that information, that story, and really recognize it to be able to follow in that tradition of extreme bravery and camaraderie.
Yeah, thank you. Of course. We're moving between decks now, and you've got some very steep stairs here. So what is the best way to go down these? Is it forward? Is it backwards? What do you recommend?
Really, it's up to personal preference. A lot of visitors we see will go down backwards facing the stairs. Really allows them to really safely get down these stairs. When you're in service, a lot of these ladder wells and the handrails were actually polished so that crew members could just pick up their feet and slide right down them to be quicker. Of course,
can you do that for us?
No. I personally, I'm not that brave to do it, but yeah, whatever way is safest for people to get down is what we recommend. This is our weapons plot and gyro. So in here is all the technology that's used to properly calibrate the guns to be able to accurately fire. We've got the targeting computers right ahead of us is essentially one of the more technologically advanced pieces of equipment we have on board, and that's just to properly train the cannons.
Look at all the gears and just the mechanical pieces in there is amazing.
It blows my mind to think that one person was able to properly install that piece of technology and have it running. It's amazing to see all of the intricate pieces working together. This is where people would come by, they would drop off their trays, dump out their trash, and this is where you would wash your dishes. You'd wash your lower enlisted members, they would get essentially a metal tray, and that's what they would wash. They would wash it, they would eat off of it, and that was all they had.
Yeah. As we move through this doorway into the next room, you can talk a little bit more about kind of how these doorways would have been used, especially in the case of an emergency or situation.
Absolutely. So these doors are designed to create a watertight seal. So they would be sealed shut with the gasket along the door, and they would pull that handle down to secure it in case there was any kind of leak in the ship. Right now we're below the water line, so any damage that happens to the side of the ship could create flooding, which is one of the two large fears on the ship, that and fires. So this allows this whole compartment to be secured so that it couldn't spread throughout the ship and create more damage. And then one big thing we like to tell people is this bottom edge of the doorway here are called knee knockers. It's self-explanatory. If you're not careful, you'll leave with a souvenir that you didn't want to have. So we like to tell people to watch your step through and then watch your head as well, because crew size back then was about 5 foot and some change, 5'5", 5'6", and it's a lot easier for people to grow throughout time, a little bit more difficult for ships to grow.
Would the Navy specifically try to bring in sailors of a certain height? Was it a situation where it's like, you would fit well on the ship, so let's try to get you here?
A lot of it was they took the average height for the country of how tall or how short people were, and that's what they worked with. There is no real way to specialize of like, hey, you're this height, you deserve to be on this ship. It was equal opportunity. If you needed to duck through, you had to duck through. I've heard stories of people that were on submarines that were too tall, and they spent their entire time crouched throughout their time on the submarine, and the only time they could sit straight up was if they were outside.
Wow. That doesn't sound enjoyable.
No, there's a special kind of person that can handle that. So in here, we're actively working to restore it. All the donations and admission costs that we collect go directly into active projects like this one throughout the ship to open it up and allow things like having Boy Scouts come on board for the day or spend the night on the ship. They can do, I know we're looking to do a STEM project on board where they can study things like radar or oceanography, things like that, and really use this ship to its full potential and hopefully open it up as best as possible.
So you see all these tables here. Is this where the crew would have eaten then?
Yep, so this is where the crew would eat. They would be able to sit down, enjoy their meal with their friends or coworkers. Every table on here actually has a lip installed on it, which allows the tray to stay in place on top of the table in rough weather.
Mm-hmm. Anyone who's been on a boat, and even relatively small waves, knows how much stuff can move around.
Especially here. Even being at the pier, you can sometimes, on rougher weather, you can still feel the ship rock side to side, and you're still able to understand the importance of keeping things in place.
And I don't think we've touched yet on food on the ship. So what are the types of things that these guys would have been eating while they were out at sea, and how often did they bring on new supplies?
They could eat pretty much anything you could eat on shore. They had a full kitchen staff that they could have on board. The officers would typically eat the same thing that the enlisted members would eat. The only difference is officers, if they wanted something different, they would pool their money together and they would chip in for what specific items they wanted. So if they wanted a certain cut of meat or they wanted some kind of treat, they would provide those funds themselves to allow the ship's crew to purchase it for them. But yeah, all of it was made one and the same for everybody. You would have things like soup, bread, burgers, anything really.
Yeah, so just because you were at sea doesn't mean that you had to eat really badly. I'm sure they actually wanted them to eat well because that obviously keeps the crew going and you need that food for energy.
Yeah, they like to be able to provide what they could. Your quality of food also would depend on how long you're out at sea. Being out in the middle of the ocean would create some logistical issues, being able to receive new food. So you'd kind of, at the end of the tour, you'd really kind of see what was left on board based off of what your meal was. At the beginning of the tour, you would typically get more of the better food, kind of make leaving home a little bit easier because you were eating a little bit better. When you were ending the tour, food kind of got what was left because you were also going home.
That makes sense.
So this is the serving line that people would get their food from. They would grab their tray and their utensils, and they would simply walk down the line. They'd get their serving of food, and they would keep moving down towards where they would eat. And they would all eat in shifts so that nobody was left their post that was unmanned. So everyone had a replacement, and they would eat in their different shifts.
Yeah, I'm sure that also just made it easier for space-wise and everything. You can't fit everybody
Exactly.
on the ship on the ship eating at the same time.
Exactly. You only had certain people eat at a certain time. Allows them to limit the amount of space they had sitting for their dining facilities and all that.
We see a red light here. So what's the reason for red light versus maybe other colors and other types of light on board the ship?
So what they found is red light actually helps your night vision a lot better. So when you go from outside indoors, going from the outside to a red light inside, your night vision was actually preserved and you were able to you'd be able to transfer quicker to an outside perspective to being able to see better at night rather than going from outside into a lit with a white light inside. Really decreases your ability to quickly transfer from that lighted to dark setting.
It's fascinating to think about design elements like that on a ship and just how many different little things can make a difference, especially in a combat situation where every little detail matters.
Yeah, it really encapsulates the technological advances going from what you might see earlier in your time frame to current. All that technology really is comprised in being able to be used throughout the time frame. You saw the different evolutions. It's really fascinating to see. So this is the kitchen back here. It's got full kitchen. It's got your kettles for things like soup. You've got your ovens. Around the corner is actually a stove, an electric stove, so you didn't have gas burning. And it's anything that you needed, that you wanted back home in a kitchen, you had on board. Back here is the bread locker, where they would store loaves of bread for crew members to come and eat. A lot of the times what they would do is they would grab a piece of bread to munch on during heavier seas because bread actually soaks up the stomach acids, decreasing your likelihood of seasickness when you didn't have meds back then.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure with this many guys on board, there were a lot of people that were getting sick.
Oh yeah, they tried to do everything they could to decrease that likelihood because if you're sick, you can't do your job. So then we've got the laundry room. So this laundry room was used to allow everybody on board to have a clean uniform. They could press their uniforms for more formal events or just do a simple cleaning for their uniforms so when they're out at sea, they could always have a fresh uniform, really stick to the hygiene standards that kept crew members safe and healthy.
Yeah, so it's not just about looking good. There's kind of the health and safety idea as well.
Exactly, yeah. And then behind you is actually our damage control locker. So throughout the ship, there are these designated locker spaces where crews could come and grab the essential items that they needed to fight fires with the different fire nozzles, or they would use these wooden plugs to be able to plug up a hole in the ship. They used wood and then a certain type of line that would expand when it was wet, which would create a better seal throughout the ship.
Are there Any incidents that you're aware of with the history of this specific ship of those kind of plugs and that type of stuff being used?
I don't off the top of my head. I'm still trying to figure out all the history from everyone else who volunteers on board. We've actually got a few members that served on this ship, still trying to pick their brain, kind of understand their sea stories as well as trying to figure out the full history of what happened on the ship.
Sure, I'm sure that there's so many little incidents and little things that happen that they, can share, and it's great to try to preserve all that.
Yeah, it's insane to see what stories they have that no one has heard of before. 'Cause maybe it wasn't recorded, or it was just a personal event that happened, and there's no other way of hearing it than by that person alone telling that story.
And you really have to think about these ships almost as like a small town, all in and of themselves. And even like the bigger ships, like a battleship, being like a larger town. There's more people that served on a battleship than in a lot of towns.
Yeah, it's these ships do seem as essentially a floating town. Aircraft carriers, I've heard, likened to a floating city. They've got their own little cliques, their own little sections. Of course, when you're working so closely with someone, you create that bond of that's essentially your neighbor. And yeah, it's really cool to see the different connections that you build just based off of being on the ship. So we'll keep going back. We've got different office spaces that crew members have used to be able to share the space as being a exhibit as well as being a functional workspace as well. So throughout the ship, we've got ship's store that was also used as a store. That room itself was used as a ship's office, or where they would process things like your paychecks, food inventories, things like all the other paperwork that took place on board.
But it's still being used kind of for the work of happening on the ship today.
Exactly. We need our workspace as well as for the ship. This next room here, this is our sick call, or our sick bay. So members could come here and get their basic health needs seen. Typically you had what they call a corpsman, and it was a young 18, 19-year-old member who had basic medical training. And the member that was working here, the same person doing surgeries, your trauma care, things like that. And a lot of times they were working with basic bare bones knowledge and kind of figuring it out as they went, and using their own experiences and shared experience to provide a better care for the rest of the crew.
You hope that the guy that you got was one of the more experienced ones, and not just figuring it out.
You treated your corpsman. It was probably one of the better treated people on board. If there was something that corpsman wanted, usually they got it. That and the cooks. If the cooks asked for something, they got it. But yeah, so we'll keep on going through. In here we have the oil lab. This is where members could bring an oil sample from down below in the engine room, and they could test it to see if the ship was balanced, so it was riding at the best possible angle, because if it's tilted off to the side or unbalanced, then the ship was most likely to capsize if it took a wave at a wrong time. They could also check the oil for things like metal fragments to see if anything was broken or needed to be repaired. And that was all done in this room itself.
Yeah, so it's almost like a laboratory in there.
Essentially,
not something you think of as normal.
It was a basic laboratory that people could use to make sure the ship was healthy, while we've got members to make sure that the shipmates are healthy.
Mm-hmm. And does this chart here kind of tie into what you were just talking about?
Yeah, so this is a schematic of the entire ship. You've got your engine spaces as well as different storage compartments that engineers were able to understand the schematic to know if something was damaged or needed to be repaired or worked on. They knew exactly where that item was, so they could go and fix it as quick as possible.
Now, do you know if something like this, is this something that the average sailor would have studied and been familiar with, or is this more detailed than something they would have known?
A little bit of both. Depending on the job, depended on how well you knew that schematic or how well you could read schematics. If you were able to read it better, you dove more into it. Just you've got a lot of time on board, you're going to dive more into it, so you could know your job better and you could rank up quicker. So as we go, we can actually look down and see the engine room down below. When we first took over the Orleck, all the deck plates in the engine room had disappeared. We don't know where they went, but when we received her, all the deck plates were missing. It was covered in old oil and grime, and really we're still working on fixing her up and trying to get all those pieces together, but it'll be a long time before we're able to open it up for people to come visit it.
There's some guy in Turkey with a whole bunch of destroyer engine deck plates like in his backyard.
I imagine there is. I'm sure someone was either very disgruntled or really loved this ship, and they're like, you know what I can remember this by? I'm going to take all the deck plates. And that's how they remembered the ship, I guess, but someone's got to have them. As we go back, we've got our armory, which is where all of our small arms or machine guns would be held when they're not being mounted on the ship. And then back here, we have our barber shop. It's a fully functional barber shop where we've got local barbers that are willing to come on board and provide free haircuts for visitors to provide more of an experience for guests to come by and experience.
That's amazing. So that still happens today. You have barbers come on board.
Yeah, in the near future, hopefully we're going to have a rotation of barbers that come by, I believe, either Saturday or Sunday, and guests can get a free haircut. And then this light above us was actually the same light that they would use for dentists. So if you needed to get your dental work done, it was the same exact spot.
Again, multi-purpose like you were talking about.
Exactly. No wasted space on board at all.
That is super cool. I love that you're still using some of those spaces today. That's really neat.
So as we come back here, this is our officers' country. So this is where the officers would stay. So you have your XO in here, where you can see the bedding and living spaces a little bit better than your lower enlisted members. Again, with rank comes privilege. Mm-hmm. And then some of the officers did have to share their space, unfortunately. Up to 2 officers were in these rooms over here. We're still trying to sort out where everything needs to go, so a lot of these spaces does serve a dual purpose for us as storage as well. And then as we go back, we would have our first lieutenant in here, who is in charge of a lot of the disciplinary actions that happen on board and keeping records of all that. So he's got a specialized room in here, as well as our chief engineer space in here, or our engineering officer, and that's where they would stay as well. So if they shared a job or different aspects of their job with other people, then they were kept together so they could communicate better as well.
Gotcha. And if it hasn't become clear as we've walked around, these hallways are not very wide. You're about one person wide here as you move through.
Yeah, the ship actually had a designated traffic pattern. So you would only use certain hallways and certain stairs to go up or down depending on what side of the ship you were on.
So it's almost like, and I don't think we've pointed out these arrows yet, but you can see the blue and orange arrows. So there's kind of like tours set up by the ship so that people can follow that.
So on board, our blue arrows is what we designate as our full tour. We use those to be able to show guests everything that's open. The orange arrows, those are for people that aren't able to go up or down stairs. I know personally some days I'm not a huge fan of stairs. And so I like to use the orange arrows, and those are just for the main deck spaces alone. We've also got pamphlets on our website as well, has additional information for guests to see, to really fill in the gaps if they miss something or they just want to dive more into the ship. Mm-hmm. So keep coming, and as we go through, of course, no tour is complete without a stop at the gift shop. So this is where we have our gift shop here, where everyone can come by, pick up a piece of Navy, military, or even USS Orleck merchandise to remember their time here. We've got memorabilia from different ships as well. So if we get families or veterans from another ship, hopefully we're able to have some sort of piece of memorabilia for them to take home with them and remember their time here by.
Yeah, that works really well. Always remember to exit through the gift shop, folks, you know?
Exactly.
You gotta pick yourself up something cool. And you can see what all of those funds go to as we've walked around the ship and just all the work that's being done here.
Exactly. So we're actively working on clearing out the lower spaces, which would hold a lot of the lower enlisted berthing spaces, so that we can open them up for guests to get a better experience when they come on board by seeing the full living spaces. That's actually one of the highly requested items on board. Everyone wants to know, where did they sleep? And that's what we're working on clearing out right now. Unfortunately, it is very hard work to get that taken care of. The deck below was actually flooded during one of the hurricanes that it suffered in Louisiana. So all the decking needs to be replaced down below that, and that's what we're working on currently.
And that ties into something that I wanted to ask you about. If people have seen this video and think, wow, this is an amazing ship, you know, how can I get involved? What can I do to help out? Are you always looking for more volunteers, and what's the best way for people to kind of get involved with that work?
Oh, we can't get enough volunteers. If there's not work one day, we will put you to work in one way or another. There's always something to do on board. It's never a job done. The best way to get in touch with us is on our website or even Facebook. You can go on those websites or the Facebook page and send us a message. We can get in touch with you that way. We've also got our email correspondence, and they reach out to people pretty much every day.
That is perfect, and we'll make sure to put a link to the website in the description of this video below, but I think that takes us back to where we started then. Yep. Here, correct? So we've followed those blue arrows and done the whole tour. This has been so incredible. Thank you so much for your time here. Thank you for sharing all your knowledge and your passion of the ship with us. It's just fascinating to learn all about this. So for everyone watching, you know, we've just given kind of the highlights tour a little bit. There's so much to experience here as you walk around this ship. I highly recommend it. It's in the middle of Jacksonville, Florida, so you know you can do lots of other stuff while you're here as well. Check it out if you're ever passing through this area. It's such a cool place to visit, so thank you so very much. I really appreciate it. Keep up the great work here.
Thank you, will do.